Hello, my name is Marnette Hofer. I am the archivist and the executive director here at the Heritage Hall Museum and Archives in Freeman, South Dakota. And today I am talking with S. Roy Kaufman, who recently wrote the book entitled The Drama of a Rural Community's Life Cycle, Its Prehistory, Birth, Growth, Maturity, Decline, and Rebirth. Big title. Welcome, Roy.
Thank you.
So first off, I have known you in the capacity as our curator here at the museum. I think you've been in this position since 2012. But I want you to tell us a bit more about your life's journey and how you came to be at this place at this time to write this book.
Good. Yeah, well, my life has been as a pastor. I was still pastor of a congregation in name, not very thoroughly, not very much, but so I've been a pastor since 1972, and I served in all 5 rural congregations, all in the Midwest, all in the general area of the Great Plains, from Saskatchewan to Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and South Dakota. So, one of the things I discovered as a pastor, in a rural congregation especially, but even otherwise, is that every congregation has a unique identity and forms a unique culture, even though, churches may be of the same denomination and have a lot of the same faith things. I mean, I think of the 2 churches that I'm most familiar with here in the Freeman community, the North and South churches. They share a common history way back for several centuries, but they have very unique identities. And I was a pastor of the South Church as their last full-time pastorate, and the South Church is quite different from the North Church, and we just have a very different culture. And so I was very intrigued by that notion of congregations as cultures. And I was also very interested in family history. From the time I was a young person, I wrote family histories, and then in the churches I served, I learned to know the genealogies of the different major family systems and what the background of these churches were, where they came from, what their history was earlier on, and so all of these things, fed into this notion of being interested in rural communities, in agrarian cultures, and that kind of thing. Now, rural communities throughout the years of my ministry have been on the decline. They've all been, and the churches I served, every one of them has shrunk in membership during the time that I served there. None of them grew. All of them declined in membership. So you start asking, what's going on here? What is this all about? Why are these things happening? And so throughout my ministry, I also tended to be invited to be a speaker during the crisis of the 1970s and 80s. I was invited to speak in rural life conferences and times when people were asking, about rural issues. And so that's a little bit of the background. I came here back to my home community. I served 3 other churches in Iowa, Illinois, and Saskatchewan, and then came home to my home congregation, something I never thought I'd do because it's a big church and I never thought I'd fit in that kind of context. But at the end of my ministry, I think it was reasonably okay to come back, and it was for sure interesting to come back to my home community where I lived all these years as a young person as well. So here I came back to the Freeman community. I served 11 years at the South Church, and then now when I retired in 2010, I started wondering what to do with my life. And one of the things that I ended up, all of a sudden they said, well, there's a position for a curator at Heritage Hall Museum. And frankly, I hadn't even paid much attention to Heritage Hall until that point, but oh, well, that's interesting. Yeah, the museum, that's, and I don't know anything about being a curator. I don't know what it even means, but, I can learn. I'm not too old to learn some new things. So I came on staff in 2012 and, started to learn how to catalog things and to write things for the museum and so on. And then after a year or two in it, you came on staff, and one of your roles as archivist was to help us tell our stories as a community. And you invited myself and two other guys in the community, two other local historian types, Bob Engbrecht and Norman Hofer, to develop the concept of three groups: Hutterisch, Low German, Swiss German, all coming to southeast South Dakota and establishing this community here at Freeman. So that's kind of what I did, and that really helped influence this book a lot. I already had started the notion of this book by that time, but it really helped shape the structure of the book, to tell about these three cultures that came to South Dakota.
Yeah, I definitely see that theme developed in here, which I appreciate, because I do think it is so important for people to understand not just one of these groups, but all, and kind of a larger perspective. One of the terms that you use quite often is, you refer to the agrarian cultures. Can you give us a quick definition of what that means?
Yeah, well, it's in contemporary thinking, agrarian studies have to do with agricultural cultures, the culture of rural communities, the culture of rural places. We call that an agrarian culture. So, and there's certain people like Wendell Berry is a very, very popular writer of the last several decades, and he was what we call an agrarian thinker. He talked a lot about agrarian life, what it means to be a farming community, what life is like in that kind of a structure. I began making I mentioned earlier that I thought that what's really important about churches is that each of them are a unique culture. And then I started thinking about the rural congregations I've served, that they really are agrarian cultures because they're engaged in agriculture. And so agrarian culture is shaped by the way that people relate to the land, how they farm, the technologies and the tools they use in farming, and that shapes their culture. They either are horse and buggy people, or they're tractor people, or they have different technologies that they use to work the land, and that's part of that agrarian culture idea that every congregation then becomes, like I would say in the book, I say often in the book that every congregation in this community, not just Mennonite, but all the congregations in our community are unique agrarian cultures. They each have their own uniqueness, their own, they may farm pretty much the same, but they each have they bring different faith perspectives, values to the way they work the land. And to understand the culture, then you have to understand these communities and their life together and how they function and how they live.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. So when you start, like your first chapter, it's entitled "The Story of the Land and Its First Inhabitants." Mm-hmm. And as I read it, I just thought it was almost cinematic. You see these video satellite shots of the universe, and then they start zooming in and you start seeing the Earth, and then North America comes into focus, and then the Great Plains, and you get down to southeast South Dakota and our community. You discuss not only the physical features of all that and how this place came to be, but you also get into the inhabitants of this place over time, before the Europeans ventured into the picture. So I am curious why you chose to start out with such a big picture type of overview.
Well, I guess partly it's a matter of faith convictions. I think everything is related to everything else. And if we want to understand who we are and where we are, we have to understand our context, where we have come from, what has shaped our lives, and where we are going. And so if you think about, talking about this community, we have to first understand, why is there Turkey Ridge? And why is there a creek down there? And why is there a James River and a Vermilion River? And where do they? And how do these geographical features shape the contours of this community? So I define the Freeman community eventually as being the area between the James River and Vermilion River, and between Turkey Ridge and the confluence of Wolf Creek and Western Vermilion River. So, that's kind of, I think we have to kind of think about our landscape as defining our community and defining who we are to a large extent. And that means, looking back to how this land was shaped geologically as well as, climatically, and understanding that. And it's foreign stuff for me. I'm not a geologist, so this was tough sledding for me, but I hope it is enough there. It's just suggestive, but I hope it's enough to make us at least aware of the larger context in which we live.
Mm-hmm. I think you did a good job of setting the scene, kind of like for the rest of the book.
I like to imagine what this was like, so I have one little part here. It's impossible for us to imagine what Southeast South Dakota would have looked like prior to the European invasion in terms of flora and fauna. Most native species of plants and animals survive here or there, but now is not at all like then. Imagine vast herds of bison covering the hills from time to time in their migrations. Imagine the range of carnivores that followed these herds. Imagine the vast tall grass prairies that met our ancestors, a vast sea of grass taller than a man. Imagine all the birds, those that live in the prairie and those that migrate, those that nest in the lakes and potholes and sloughs left by the glaciers, and those on the rivers and streams carved out by glacial runoff. Imagine the color of the prairie in full summer bloom when the forbs of the prairie appear in force. Imagine the lightning-ignited prairie fires that burned and revitalized the prairie every few years. Here and there along the rivers and streams, imagine small bands of humans, the first inhabitants of this land, preceding by centuries, the First Nations tribes whose names we know. Yeah.
It's such it parallel, to me it seems like it parallels so much what we try to tell, the story we want to tell. Absolutely. Here at the museum.
Here at the museum, you bet.
And yeah, we continue to strive toward that. It isn't necessarily all in place now, but that's awesome. You move on then into kind of what you called the prehistory of the Germans from Russia cultures that eventually came to this area. And you specifically detail those three Anabaptist groups, the Low German Mennonites, the Swiss Amish, and the Hutterites, as they journeyed across Europe to Russia and then eventually here to the United States. Talk to us a bit about why you feel that prehistory is so important to the overall message of your book.
Well, cultures live, elements of our culture live for generations and centuries in our life together. And the way we lived from, let's say, the 15th century when the Anabaptist movement started until more recent times, that represented values, ways of living, ways of believing, ways of thinking that shaped the kind of agriculture we did. It shaped how we valued the animals and the plants in our care, how we took care of things. And so to really understand, the cultures that make up the Freeman community, you have to understand their history, their past, where they came from, what shaped them. Why did they go where they did? Why did they, and what did they learn there? What did they lose there? What did they, how was their life shaped by the different journeys that they made through the centuries? And that's part of the story that I think is really important. And of course, for me, it was very, that's my story. And it's the story of our community. And so for me, it was very interesting to tell it and try to put together the pieces, which there were lots of bits and pieces that I've had in my head for years, but to be able to really round it out and put together those contexts and the way we moved and where we came from and why we went where we went. When we came to America, there was a push and a pull. The push was that the Russian Empire was making Germans in Russia become Russian, and we didn't want to become Russian, so we got pushed by that policy to leave. The pull was that America had just conquered the Midwest and the Great Plains and driven off the Indians, and now wanted European settlers who were civilized and Christian to come, and white, to come and settle the land, because these red people were gone and we didn't, they were done. As far as we were concerned, and so we wanted to replace them with white. America wanted to replace them with white European Christian people. And so that was the pull. They said, you can have free land. This Homestead Act of 1862, a 3/4 section of land, just come and take it and live there. And so we said, oh, that sounds pretty good. All our lives in Europe, we were persecuted. We lived as second-class citizens. We worked for noblemen who owned the land but didn't give us very good deals a lot of times and drove us here and there. Now we got free land, and the government says we can even be pacifist Christians, so good deal.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so interesting. Or I found that very interesting and also a bit challenging, because we tend to just, we go about our daily lives and we're so entrenched in today's world that we don't think about all those influences that have brought us to these places and shaped who we are. And you also touch on the fact that along the way there are unintended consequences that we may not realize at the time. We certainly probably would not choose, but they happen. I have a quote here. In chapter 5, you write, "American settlement of the Great Plains would come at the cost of the destruction of the cultures and peoples of the Indian nations." And it's a topic you return to quite often throughout the book. I don't know. You've talked about it some. Is there more you could say about this connectedness of the Earth's inhabitants?
Yeah, I mean, one of the at one point in the book, I make the point which I've often made as a pastor that, in Genesis, Abraham comes to the promised land of Canaan as a sojourner and a pilgrim, and Genesis 12 says, at the time the Canaanites were in the land. This was not empty land for Abraham when he came there. He had to learn how to live in the midst of a people that were there. And this is our story as well. We have to learn to live with the people who are here before us. I suggest in the book that the future of our community may well depend on our ability to come to terms with the Yankton Sioux Nation, from whom we kind of took this land as a nation. And if we really want to live here and really want to succeed as a nation, as a community, we need to come to terms with our neighbors who still live here among us. And almost 9% of the South Dakota population is Native American. I mean, they're not out of here. They're still here. They're still our neighbors. And if we want to succeed as a community, we took the land from them, but now perhaps our calling is to learn how to live with them and to re-empower them, to allow them to reintegrate their culture and their practices into their life, so that we can learn from them about how to live on this land, which is new to us. Mm-hmm. We've only been here 150 years.
That was something I appreciated too. You really talked about each of these agrarian cultures, congregational perhaps, mm-hmm. That they should hang on to and learn from. Hang on to is maybe not the right word. Mm-hmm. Appreciate, learn from, value, honor, all those things, their past and their stories, mm-hmm. and that will make them stronger and more able to reach out across to each other, which we haven't always done a good job of.
We've done a very poor job of that.
Uh-huh. and I noted here too that sometimes you paint a very idyllic picture of agricultural and community life in this region. And at other times, your assessment of current farming practices and institutions and relationships and such is quite harsh. You acknowledge that you were coming of age during the high points of this cycle, this life cycle, the prehistory, birth, growth, maturity, decline, and rebirth. I mean, you kind of grew up in maybe the best of times, and maybe we all think we do, but just looking at population trends, I mean, you kind of have the facts to back that up. You also note that you have felt like a voice crying in the wilderness, warning that the decline that is already beginning right now in rural communities like ours across the Great Plains, not just here, mm-hmm. but in so many areas, is already beginning. If you had to condense your entire message, this entire book, into just one paragraph, what would you say?
to condense the entire book into one paragraph. I mean,
Maybe that's not
I've worked
possible.
7 years on this book. Well, I guess one of the things that I try to say is that, rural communities come and rural communities go. And, I think that maybe I don't like that. I used to really be anxious about that message, and say,
Nobody wants to hear it?
nobody wants to hear that, and I don't want to hear it, and I don't want my community to fade from this scene. I don't want things to be different, but we're always on a journey. We never stay the same. I mean, our cultures are always changing in a lot of different ways. You look at the agriculture of 150 years ago, and you look at the agriculture of today. We started out with scythes, which there is one here just in front of me in this museum. Reaping grain by hand, and then we ended up with the thrashing machine, and then there's a combine behind us over there, and so we keep using different technologies, different methods of farming and of living, and that's good. It's nothing. There's something good about that. And yeah, I'm very critical of certain aspects of industrial agriculture that we see in the community around us. But it's not that I'm critical of the farmers. None of us are. There's no right or wrong way to farm. It's just that we choose different methods, and it's really more of a failure of the community than it is of individual farmers. Everybody has to make their own choices, but we as a community can also influence the direction that we move. And so part of my, this is more than one paragraph already, but part of what I would say is that if the message of the book is, hey, let's pull together and find new ways of living on the land in relationship to other people around us, in relation to nature, and let's find a way that's more sustainable, more hopeful for the future, that brings us, into a better future for the whole of humanity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
I think that is, I felt that too. It was almost, I don't want to say a love story to your community, but it's a very impassioned plea that we can be better, we can do better, we can move forward. Mm-hmm. It's a look back, but it's also a visionary a view of the future. I don't know what else to ask you. Are there other things that we should bring up and highlight?
Well, I know there's things that people will be troubled by and offended by in the book. Partly the agricultural critique is pretty strong at points. The future that I envision for the Freeman community, I spent maybe 10 pages talking about what I envision the future of this community to look like in 2050. Another generation from now, and basically, I would see it as returning in some ways to a simpler agriculture. I would see us raising food for people rather than commodities for a global market. I think it's important that we move toward local food systems that are sustainable, within a community base, but also then to provide food for the regional towns of Yankton and Mitchell and Sioux Falls. We need to be engaged in providing for these things, because that's our mission as rural people. That's what we're about, is to raise food for people. We co-opted by corporations and by government and by technocracy to really serve interests beyond our community, and that's hurt us. We have to reassert the values and the needs of our own community rather than serve the corporations and government policies that are around us.
And when you say hurt us, how?
Well, we have been put in competition with each other through the industrialization of agriculture, so that the population we have now is almost half of what it was in the 1930s. We've lost our community values to where we think of the land not as not as ours, as a community, but as mine. And what I do with it is my business. And individualism, which is the American virtue, highest of all, has taken over a lot of our faith values of community and of living together. I should say that probably my biggest critique is not agriculture, and it's not even our adaptation to industrial methods of farming. It's the values that and the faith that I think we've thought lost. When we came to this country, we tried to figure out where we fit within the structures of American society. And we basically had kind of two options out there in the 1920s and 30s. One was fundamentalism, which is kind of an emphasis on right doctrine and personal salvation. And the other was modernism, which was more of a movement towards social justice and kind of moving in trying to do better things for more people. And we were attracted to both of those in different ways because we were Mennonites with a peace position, so modernism looked good. But on the other hand, these modernists also questioned key elements of Scripture, and they didn't believe in certain things. And so a lot of us were also drawn to fundamentalism, which is emphasis on Bible doctrine and correct belief. Well, we came here with an idea that, as Anabaptists especially, we had discipleship as our major emphasis, following Jesus in life. And we had, and that meant that that salvation was the formation of a community. It was not, we believed in eternal life. But basically, salvation was the formation of a community where people could live together and serve the common good and live out God's vision for people's lives here on earth. So when we became fundamentalists, or when that became an influence for us, we substituted doctrine, believing the right things, for discipleship. And we substituted salvation in the hereafter, eternal life, for the structure of the community as a manifestation of our salvation. And so, my biggest critique is on persons like myself, who are spiritual leaders of these communities, and we failed to help them retain the spiritual values that I think are deeply needed for an agrarian kind of culture.
Oofda.
So my critique is of people like me, first of all.
Interesting.
and then, sure, I can see a lot of things wrong with the way we farm and our acceptance of American culture. We become too acculturated. With lots of things I can criticize, but I think the biggest thing is that, we've not paid enough attention to our theological perspectives that inform our values and shape our lives.
Mm-hmm. So it's a challenge.
It's a challenge for me, and it's a challenge for our churches, to really do that. So, yeah.
And you see this as something that is happening in communities across the Midwest or across the Great Plains.
And
it's
not just Anabaptism. And I make that point at a certain in one of the last chapters. I say, I explain how Anabaptism informs our local cultures here. But I also say, if you're Catholic or Orthodox or Protestant, there's also, those people also have, in their Christian traditions, these perspectives that could really shape our common life. And also, even other faiths. I think of the Muslim community that I visited several times in the last 10 years in Palestine, where they're besieged by settlements around them. They have no freedom, but they hang on to their land and their homes on a dirt dry place because they love this land, and for them it's a spiritual place. It's a spiritual mission to take care of their land.
So this is a scenario that plays out across
all over the world.
It is a drama that plays out across the world. All these scenes, these acts.
Birth, growth, life,
right.
Death. It's a continual process, and we're all in the middle of it somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
We can be threatened by it, and often we are. But I think it's also, what I hope we can gain, what I hope the book can help us gain from it is that it's also a challenge for us to figure out where we are in the drama. Where are we
Which
at?
act are we in?
Which act are we in? Is it the closing act or is it the new beginning?
Yeah.
And the last
Can
two
we change the
chapters,
story?
the last two chapters have the question: is this a death or is it a new birth? I don't know. I don't know.
My kids used to read these books about, you can choose your own ending.
Yeah,
and in a lot of ways we can. It's going to take a
But
group,
it takes a group effort.
a group effort,
Yeah,
it's a little bit daunting.
Yeah, it's daunting. And the other thing I think that I would really, that I haven't really talked about much is taking nature as our guide. I talk a lot about it because we've assumed that we have the science to be able to control and manipulate nature, and we do.
Right.
But those often carry devastating consequences that we didn't foresee when we introduced them. We didn't foresee that DDT was going to kill birds all over we didn't. There's just every technology has its ill effect in some way in our system. And so, it's really important for me that we begin to learn again to take nature as our teacher and our guide in understanding how to farm and how to live on the land.
Much as the Native Americans
much as
have
Native
done
Americans
for
do.
generations.
Much as they've done for years. Yeah.
Well, I think we can wrap it up. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your insights, your knowledge, your wisdom through this book. Your historical data, I think, is so important and valuable to document. And of course, I would say that because we're in a museum.
You're an archivist.
But and I also felt like your message is enlightening, and it's definitely challenging. It will be interesting to see how people respond, if they choose to respond, and move forward with that. We are also pleased as a museum that Roy is allowing us to sell his book at our mercantile. So I'll put a plug in that if you're interested in getting a copy, you can either go to our website and contact us via the information there, or stop by and check out our mercantile, pick up a copy of his book and a few other things.
What are your hours? What are your hours?
Oh, the hours. In the winter months, we're open like from October through April. We're open from 12 to 4 weekdays. We're closed on holidays. And then in the summer, we'll be open from May through September. We're open every day, 9 to 4 during the weekdays, and then 1 to 4 on weekends. I think that's it.
Thank you so much for the opportunity of sharing about the book. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.